The Daily Code Snippet. This past week, we went over the background image property, how to set up gradients, and hero images. This week, let's start by talking about how to load a background image into an element. In order to do this, we will use the background image property. This property can be used to load in one or more images into a single element. It is always good practice to set a background color for the element as well, just in case the image is not available. To set the background image, we use this syntax. URL indicates we will tell the browser where to find the image. In this example, we have also set a background color, a light gray color. The default for a background image is to be placed at the top left corner of an element and repeated both vertically and horizontally. By setting a background repeat, you can have the image not repeat. So in our example, we have added a CSS rule for background repeat and set it to no-repeat. When using more than one image, separate them using a comma. And you can also indicate whether you want to repeat the background image or not by using a comma to separate your commands. In this example with two images, the first image will not repeat, but the second image will repeat. We will now look at an example of using the background image property. We are taking some code from a previous example where we showed how to wrap text around photographs within an article. But instead of the full width container image we had for that, we will load a background image into our body, then our first section will overlap that image. Let's take a look. Now let's look at the HTML. Most of this code is the placeholder text for our article. Since this page only has a single article, we have removed any navigation from the header and only have a single section. Here is our CSS. We are loading the background image into the body. Because we only want the image to display once at the top, we have set the background repeat to no repeat. If the image doesn't load, we would just want a white background. We will only focus on the CSS that is relevant to our exercise. Our container that has our content is set to 80% the browser width and is centered. By setting the height to 300 pixels, it allows the first section to overlap. Finally, our first section will also have a background color that is white to separate it from the background. By adding the padding, it gives us some space between the edges and the text in the section that overlaps. What would happen if we have a repeating image? The key change we would make is in our CSS. We will change the background repeat to repeat. This is the result. The image will repeat horizontally and vertically. Since our image spans the full width, it repeats vertically. Now let's look at an example with more than one image loaded as a background image. We have made no changes to the HTML, but here's the CSS. We are loading two new images, one of a palmetto and the other of a water background with a turtle. Neither image will repeat. We add the background color as a backup. This is how it would display. And finally, here is the CSS to repeat one of the images, the palmetto. And here is the result. From a design perspective, you would never do this. It is simply to illustrate the function of the code. Even loading more than one image is probably something you would only do occasionally, as it is difficult to visually work with two images loading into the same element and have them go together well, especially with responsive design. The technique has been used where one of the images creates a textured background and the repeating element creates a pattern as an overlay. But again, it is not likely something you would see on modern websites. There are other possible values for background image. None is the default. No background image will be displayed. Linear gradient sets a linear gradient from top to bottom if at least two colors are defined. Repeating linear gradient repeats a linear gradient. Radial gradient sets a radial gradient from the center out if at least two colors are defined. Repeating radial gradient repeats a radial gradient. We will go through some examples that show you how to use this code. Here is the HTML. In each section, we have a div with a unique ID attribute so we can target that div with CSS to demonstrate different gradient options. First, we will look at a linear gradient with 2 colors. In each of our examples, the height of our gradient will be 500 pixels. We also set a background color as a default. If for some reason the linear gradient code is not recognized by the browser. In this case, we have set the background color to be a light gray. Now our background image is set to linear gradient, with the top color being blue and the lower color being gray. And the background will transition between the 2 colors. Next, we will look at a linear gradient with 3 colors. Everything is the same except we have added yellow to be the final transition color. Next, we will repeat the linear gradient. In this case, we still have 3 colors, and we will explain the use of percentages. The percentages indicate how you want to transition between the colors. Next, we will look at another type of gradient, a radial gradient. Again, we set our background color to be a light gray, and in this case, our radial gradient will transition from a center blue color to gray at the edges. Next, we will add a third color to our radial gradient. In this case, the final color at the edges will be yellow. And finally, we will repeat the radial gradient. The addition of the percentages specifies the color stop points along the gradient. It is a way to customize the transition. If no position is declared, the default is to be placed halfway between the one that precedes and the one that follows. It is possible to further customize gradients in our backgrounds. For example, a linear gradient by default moves top to bottom, but it is possible to change the direction of the color transition. We can do this by adding a side or color value. We do this by adding the word to and then indicating left, right, top, or bottom. The default is to bottom. To go to a corner, you would indicate this by top right, top left, bottom right, and bottom left. Here is the HTML for the examples we review. Again, we have added custom ID attributes to each div to be able to target them to test our examples. Rather than going top to bottom, the color transition moves right to left. Here we are instructing the transition to occur from the top left corner to the bottom right corner. With regards to specifying an angle, we understand top, right, bottom, and left are the same as 0 degrees, 90 degrees, 180 degrees, and 270 degrees. So any other point would be translated into an angle. Here we are trying out an angle of 235 degrees. We added percentages to our linear gradient rule to adjust the gradient in our previous example. This is considered a color stop. It can be indicated by a length and used percentages to specify it. In this example, we are trying a color stop on the blue color at 5%, the light gray color at 30%, and the orange color at 40%. A color hint defines the point between two color stops at which the transition will occur. The default for the midpoint of the color transition is the midpoint between two color stops. Here, the color stops are the same as the previous example, but we have added a color hint between the blue and light gray colors at 10% and 90% between the orange and red colors, and you can see how the transition changes. Finally, it is possible to combine the different ways to customize our gradient. Here we have combined a change in direction using an angle, and we have added color hints and color stops. Another type of background image that we should discuss is a hero image. A hero image is a large banner image that is prominently displayed on a web page. Usually it is front and center, and it is meant to grab the attention of the viewer so that they are directed to the content that is below it. In our example, we are loading our hero image into our header. As we scroll down, we see we have multiple articles with text wrapping around our images and 2 full browser width images as well. Here is the CSS. There are several elements to a hero image. Just like other background images, we should set a background color as a backup. Just like our other examples, it is a light gray color, and a hero image is not repeated. And we introduced 2 new properties, background position and background size. The former tells the browser how the image should display in the space given to it. In this case, it is centered. And we set the background size to cover, which means the image is resized to fill the entire container. Finally, we must set a height, and in this case we set it to 800 pixels. We have set the position to relative, but this is not related to it being a hero image. We set the position to relative so that we can absolutely position our text, our H1, in the top left corner. And this is the HTML we are working with. You can see that in addition to our hero image, we have 2 full browser width images that are used to visually break the content as we scroll down. We have bolded the HTML so it is easier to identify. As previous, the placeholder text has been truncated. The section content is constrained to 80% of our browser width, and we have several images floated both to the left and right that our text will wrap around. Since we are not constraining all our content for this example, we have removed the container element. Instead, certain sections have the rule constrain the width to 80% of the browser width. Here is the CSS for our browser-wide images. And here is how that would visually display again. Presented by Designers Learn Code.